Rejected, but not rescinded. After decades of demands by indigenous peoples across the Americas, the Vatican has formally repudiated a 500-year-old doctrine used to justify European colonial conquest. Does it serve to right the wrongs of the past, or is the damage irreparable? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Doctrine of Discovery. Well, earlier this month, the Vatican formally rejected its Doctrine of Discovery. The papal decree, or bull, was declared centuries ago and was used to legitimize the seizure of indigenous lands, mostly in Africa and the Americas. Now, riddled with racial and religious superiority, it eventually insinuated its way into the more modern laws of the United States, Canada, and Latin America. It justified what today would commonly be judged as illegal land seizures and human rights abuses. And though it's taken centuries to repudiate, the Vatican statement says the decree has never been considered expressions of the Catholic faith. Last year, during a visit to the Canadian Arctic, Pope Francis apologized to First Nations people for the evil of the country's Catholic residential schools. Now, those schools became notorious for abuse and even murder of Canadian Indigenous children as they were forced to assimilate to white Catholic culture. Church doctrine also allowed Portugal and Spain to take territories in Africa and the rest of the Americas, and many argued it still informs government policy and laws in the United States. Here's a closer look.
The Doctrine of Discovery states that an explorer from a European Christian country can take ownership of any land they discover, regardless of any non-Christian inhabitants, and concede it to their home country. The papal bulls divided the world between Portugal and Spain, giving them free power, authority, and jurisdiction of every kind over all non-Christian lands. Most importantly, it gave them permission to enslave millions of people. The Doctrine of Discovery became a legal principle through a U.S. Supreme Court case in 1823. Two men bought same land, one purchased it from a Native American and the other from a federal government. The judge decided it did not belong to the Native American because it was never his to begin with. 65 years later, that decision was reflected in Canadian courts. The Supreme Court decided that land did not belong to Indigenous people, because it became federal property when Europeans discovered it. Over hundreds of years, backed by the Doctrine, precedents were set that led to the seizures of Indigenous lands and the displacement of Indigenous peoples.
I am touched by the way in which the document doesn't close the book. It doesn't attempt to say, and that's that, and we'll have no more of that, thank you.
Well, some Indigenous leaders have welcomed the statement as a good first step, but others have criticized the Vatican for not actually rescinding the doctrine in its entirety.
Doctrine of Discovery itself has been used as a tool to dispossess Indigenous peoples of our inherent right to the lands upon which we live. But as you look throughout time, it's led to very racist, genocidal policies and practices by colonizing governments.
Well, let's get another opinion now on what the Vatican's repudiation really means for the Doctrine of Discovery. Joining me from Washington is Mark Charles. He is the co-author of the book, Unsettling Truths, the ongoing dehumanizing legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. Mark, thanks so much for joining us. Are you impressed with what the Vatican has done here? Is it a game changer?
Well, before I begin, let me just say I'm speaking to you from what most people call Washington, D.C., but they're the traditional lands of the Piscataway. I moved here from the Navajo Nation with my family about 8 years ago, and I just want to honor the Piscataway as the host people of the lands where I'm living. And no, I was not impressed with what the Vatican did with the apology. They had a very real opportunity to deliver a meaningful apology. And instead, they delivered a very politicized, not even apology, but just a statement that seemed more intent on protecting the Vatican and the Catholic Church from legal liability than actually dealing with the injustice that not only were they complicit in, but they have helped perpetuate for the past 400 or 500 years. Yeah, there's a lot of very specific parts of the statement that I was very displeased with.
Yeah, and I mean, just in the title of your book, you say the doctrine's legacy is ongoing. So in what form does it still actually persist today?
Yeah, so it persists in our legal system, right? In the way that Native nations in the United States of America are treated. The doctrine of discovery, and Stephen Newcomb, who has written beautifully about the doctrine of discovery and its legacy in our nation. You know, the doctrine of discovery goes all the way back in our legal system to a Supreme Court case in 1823, Johnson versus McIntosh, which was deciding the legal precedent for land titles. And they used the doctrine of discovery as part of that precedent. That legacy, that precedent gets referenced as recently as 2005 in the Supreme Court case Oneida Indian Nation versus the city of Charlotte, New York, where the Oneida Indian Nation was attempting to reestablish some of their ancient sovereignty. And in the first footnote of the case, where they're establishing precedent, the Supreme Court references by name the doctrine of discovery. And so not only is it used legally, and it's very interesting, right? Because you would think if we were talking about land title, we would go back to a treaty. The U.S. has hundreds of treaties it's written with Native nations, but because virtually every treaty they wrote has been broken, when they want to establish precedent and land title, they don't reference treaties because they broke all those treaties. They go back to their doctrine of discovery.
Right. It's amazing, too. That opinion was actually written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. It was an 8-1 ruling.
I have shocked audiences all over the country when I drop her name as the person who wrote and delivered that opinion, because her opinion, her legacy is that she's fighting for the rights of the marginalized, a voice of dissent on a conservative Supreme Court when she was there, which she did very well until it came to land titles. And because land titles are still based on the legal understanding that natives aren't human, we're savages, I say this is what makes white supremacy a bipartisan value, which she demonstrated in her opinion.
It's amazing, yeah, because she pointed out one of the reasons she ruled against the Oneidas was this long delay, as she said, in seeking judicial relief against the state of New York involved. I mean, there was no statute of limitations declared at the time when their land was initially taken. So I felt it interesting that was argued as a point against the Oneidas. But let me ask you this, because the Supreme Court would effectively be the body now that could deliver some sense of justice to indigenous populations in the United States today. Do you think, when it comes to land claims or any other case, that there's any hope with the Supreme Court that there might be some level of justice doled out to indigenous populations?
Not without some very foundational level change to our Constitution and our nation. So we have several challenges, which is, first of all, we have to look very closely at the repudiation given by the Vatican as this joint statement. The repudiation has 9 points into it. And 2 or 3 of the points deal directly with the doctrine of discovery, points 5, 6, and 7. Point 6 literally states the doctrine of discovery is not a teaching of the Catholic Church. It basically says the writings of our popes were co-opted by governmental and colonial powers and used to their own political ends. Now, maybe the doctrine of discovery wasn't preached from the pulpit, but if you read these papal bulls, they are addressed directly to the kings and the leaders and the explorers coming from these European nations. So they may not have been taught publicly, but they did get used in these private tutoring sessions to say, this is what you have the right to do.
Mark,
So now what this does, one of the challenges of the doctrine of discovery is not only is it used legally within our nation, like in the Supreme Court cases, Johnson versus McIntosh, or the city of Sherrill versus Oneida Indian Nation, but it's created this worldview, this dysfunctional theological worldview that we have that literally says white people are superior and natives are inferior. And so if you look at the recent case, just a few months ago, it came out in 2020, are actually in 2022, the McGirt case, right? Where the McGirt versus the state of Oklahoma. And in that ruling, so this was the ruling that said all of Eastern Oklahoma was for judicial purposes a reservation. And the McGirt was saying no, based on treaty, that land, well, he was saying that was a reservation. The state of Oklahoma was saying it was not. We've never treated it as a reservation.
Okay.
And in the ruling, which agreed with McGirt, it said that it ruled in favor of McGirt, but it said the state can't break the treaty and the court can't break the treaty, but anytime the legislature, anytime Congress can muster the will, they can break a treaty with Native nations on a whim, and there's nothing anyone can do to hold them accountable for it.
Okay. One of the things that Ruth Bader Ginsburg also argued was that, it's really too late to go back. You're kind of opening this can of worms. History is history, and this is how these decisions have been made and developed now over centuries. It's just too hard to go back. And some have pointed out a level of irony or a contradiction because so many Indigenous people are very proud Americans, very proud Canadians.
Yes.
I mean, I remember seeing a powwow in Missouri back in the 90s where the US flag was front and center in a massive ceremony. And many people were devout Christians displaying the cross. I mean, do you think Indigenous communities have been able to kind of balance their Indigenous identities with the nationality that many say subjugated them in the first place and owes them now today?
If you look at the rate of people who serve in the military, Native Americans have one of the highest rates of enlistment in the U.S. military, and they fight valiantly for our nation, including the code talkers from the Navajo and other tribes who used our language, the language that literally just a few months before they enlisted was being beaten out of them in residential schools and boarding schools. They then went into the military and used that language to essentially save this country during World War II. And so, yes, Native Americans can be very, very patriotic and fight fiercely for this land that we all live on and that we all co-inhabit together. And so I think what we need to do, and this is one of the things I talk about very frequently, there's a quote used by a Aboriginal leader from Canada, and it was used when he was writing about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened in Canada. And he used a quote that says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to have community, he said, you have to start by creating common memory.
Okay.
I think that's truly what so many Native peoples are trying to do. We have an oral history that goes back hundreds, thousands of years from pre-contact. And we want to find a way to share that history with these uninvited guests in our lands in an attempt to create a healthier community.
Mark Charles, we'll have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for being with us on this segment of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Well, let's broaden out the discussion now. And joining me from Rome is David McCallum, the Executive Director of the Discerning Leadership Program. From Calgary, Canada is Indigenous Consultant Rachel Snow. And from Long Beach, California, Stephen Newcomb, the author of Pagans in the Promised Land, Decoding the Doctrine of Christian Discovery. He is also the co-founder of the Indigenous Law Institute. Thanks all so much for being with us. David, let me start with you as much as you can from the Vatican's perspective. Why was this repudiation finally deemed necessary? And explain some of the wording chosen as an apology and what it really says.
I think that the visit of Pope Francis to Canada this past year had a very profound effect, not only on the Pope, but also on all those who are involved in the the discernment really about how to respond to repeated requests over many, many years, initiated by Stephen and Rachel and many others, for this repudiation. And in the course of the visit last summer, it was very clear that the understanding of the doctrine of discovery and its impact was not evenly shared amongst people who are often responsible for setting policy or creating these statements. And over the past year, I think a great deal of consideration was given to understanding the questions and issues at a greater depth, and also crafting a statement that was appropriate, at least to express, in particular, this notion of repudiation, which is to say, the Vatican recognizes its responsibility in its part in this colonial settler project that was undergoing, that was transpiring in the 16th century, but also 15th and 16th century. But more than that, the idea that the mindset that gave rise to this doctrine of discovery, this mindset of cultural superiority, is not at all consistent with the way that the church thinks of its place in society today.
Okay.
And that there is sincere regret for the ways in which this mindset gave rise to not just the colonial project, but also the way in which evangelization has been done over the years.
Okay. Stephen, let me get to Stephen quickly. Is this, in your opinion, is this repudiation good enough?
Well, thank you for having me here. I knew Delawensa Steve Newcomb, Nulalendum Elipaok. Just saying a greeting in our Lenape language. And I think that I want to set context conversation, which is the original free existence of our nations and peoples extending back to the beginning of time through our oral histories and traditions, contrasted with the system of domination that was brought by ship across the ocean and imposed on everyone and everything. And the huge part of the driving force of that system of domination was the Vatican papal documents from the 15th century that issued, these papal bulls were issued by various popes and asserting and assuming a claim of a right of domination against our nations and peoples through the Christian world. And I think that that is what we're dealing with. When my friend Dementor Virgil Kilstraight and I, Virgil was from the Oglala Lakota Nation, a traditional headman and ceremonial man. And when we began our efforts, we did so calling upon Pope John Paul II to formally revoke the Inter Cetera Papal Bull of May 4th, 1493, as symbolic of those series of papal bulls. And I'd like to get in, as we go along here, I'd like to get more specifically into the language of those documents. But
okay,
in response to your question, I don't think that it goes far enough, because it was reframing our initial issue. And we're still calling for the revocation of the papal bull and perhaps even that whole series of papal bulls.
right. Rachel, let me come to you, because you had said before that it's not just about the Vatican, and you're actually pretty tired of apologies. Now, this might be an even more elaborate apology, but it doesn't rescind the doctrine. And it still leaves the governments, the Canadian government, as you know, in particular, left to take the steps that you want to see taken to do right by the people that were wronged under the doctrine of discovery. So tell us what you think needs to be done now to make the kinds of amends that you think First Nations people deserve.
Good morning, Ambawashte. I just wanted to add on to the first question, saying that I don't think this has gone anywhere near far enough as an apology or to try to make any kind of amends to the colonial effects that have had genocidal effects on the First Nations in North America, that is in Canada and in the United States. I think that we have heard apologies over and over, and the apologies don't carry any weight because the policy or the underlying wrong or harm that was done from that initial bull, from that initial papal bull, is still in effect in Canada today, is still causing harm for my people here in Canada. And until that is rescinded or revoked, until there are adequate reparations made for the First Nation people of North America, for the Native American people, we're not going to, all we get is empty apologies. All we are having is words.
Rachel,
and actually,
if you can, be specific. How is it harming your people today?
Well, because we still have the colonial effects in place, such as the things that are happening in Canada right now, with Canada adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, domesticating it under Canadian law, which is in effect taking the heart or the international status of that document and subsuming it under Canadian law so that Canada can define it. Then it becomes an ongoing battle where we don't have that international, where we don't have the international clout or the international stance to make arguments against Canada, because now some of our would-be leaders have agreed to let this document come under Canada's control. And that's, again, perpetuating terra nullius, perpetuating the doctrine of discovery, perpetuating all the effects of colonization.
Now, I'm going to ask all three of you this question, but let me go back to David to begin with this, because there are those, as you know, who say, we need to let this go. It's hundreds of years old. History is history. The past is the past. And it's come too far to actually correct anyway, particularly in the terms that Rachel is speaking of, because it has in many ways been intertwined in modern law. So, David, what do you say to the people who say this should not even be an issue anymore?
I don't agree with them at all, to be honest with you. I think that the history that we're talking about is incredibly traumatic, and it has, as both Rachel and Stephen have said, lasting effects. It needs to be reckoned with. You know, there's a specific framework today known as restorative justice, and restorative justice really calls for those who have been the generational victims of genocide or trauma to be able to articulate clearly and define what are the terms that will help in the process of healing and progress. And I think that that framework is an important one for this conversation. I think that the issues that both Stephen and Rachel are pointing to are essential, not just at the level of the church, but also these governments. Where are the spaces internationally where these kinds of concerns can be dealt with in a way that respects the sovereignty of these Indigenous nations? Where are the spaces where accountability, appropriately positioned, makes claims for reparations, for the rearticulation of legal constructs, especially related to property, which is one of the original issues here. So I would say to those who feel like this is a dead issue, that they only need to have conversations with people from the nations, from the various Indigenous communities where people have spoken up to know better. And yeah.
Rachel, quickly, I'm going to come to you again because I saw you shaking your head, disagreeing with what David was initially saying. Why?
Restorative justice. Again, if we have restorative justice, but it's under the parameters of mainframe or mainstream defined justice, that isn't restorative justice to us. That is not the application of First Nation Indigenous laws. What it is some sort of taking what we know to be our laws or our Indigenous traditions and subsuming them again under Canadian law. Therefore, in fact, making anything like restorative justice or using these types of words, it's a word game. It's not about us. It's not about reparations. It's not about the revocation of all the harm being done. It's just Band-Aid on a gunshot wound.
Stephen, do you agree there?
Well, I think that the detail is very important. I was recently at one of the First Nations communities, and a woman took the stage and said that she had lost 12 members of her family to suicide, her immediate family. Those are the types of things that are afflicting uh, First Nations communities, and because of the trauma, because of the way in which the residential schools and the boarding schools were used as a genocidal weapon against our nations and peoples to destroy our languages, cultures, and spiritual traditions, our very identity as nations and peoples. That the reverberation of that through generations is still ongoing. And that's a consequence of the way in which the Vatican unleashed a system of domination on the planet. For example, in the 1455 papal bull Romanus Pontifex, it said that the King of Portugal was to go to the western coast of Africa and to invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and take away all their possessions and property. Yet the Vatican statement that was recently issued said that the popes have stood against violence and slavery and social injustice and oppression. So that can't possibly be true. Those are completely contradictory.
Okay, so Stephen, quickly, what can be done to rectify this now?
I think what I'm doing is asking the question, why is it and how is it that the claim of a right of domination has been made into the organizing principle of the planet? And that goes across the board. Why is it that the effort to dominate and control others rather than to have peaceful relations seems to be the theme of the world? And we have traditional teachings and understandings and concepts and wisdom and knowledge systems that have been evolved over countless generations, thousands and thousands of years, that have been ignored, and they provide things for the planet.
But then, Stephen, quickly, I mean, that was the argument that some people are saying it's too late to go back. Yes, you have these histories and this history and these traditions, but too many indigenous civilizations have now been assimilated in a way that makes it impossible to restore that kind of tradition and history. Do you accept that?
No, not at all, because those are self-serving arguments that just benefit more. They perpetuate the domination. And so how do we come to terms with that? We're really talking about the doctrine of domination. Discovery was simply the effort to locate and identify those places where their system of domination was not yet existing. That's very clear from the record. And when you go into the specifics of the Latin, particularly, you'll see that very, very well laid out. So the monarchs were given directives by the popes, various popes, to wage war against non-Christian peoples wherever they were located. And that's what we're dealing with. The system is ongoing.
David, I'd like to get a final word in from you then. I mean, do you think it's fair to describe this as a doctrine of domination that truly is still active today, that the Vatican itself needs to address and reverse in any way possible?
I think that as Catholics, the Vatican, the Pope, the Curia, religious orders have to come to terms with the damage that was done inadvertently or intentionally as the church worked alongside monarchs and merchants in this colonial project. And that the domination that Stephen speaks of is completely inconsistent with the way that we think of the values and virtues of the gospel, and that there needs to be atonement for that. I agree also with Rachel that apologies aren't enough, that the proposition right now is for some kind of a commission to move forward that would be composed of Indigenous scholars and those also appointed by the church to work together in some ways to advise, to understand, to help support the discernment of the way in which the church can partner with and accompany Native peoples in their own important project for
Okay.
liberation, for reparation. Yeah.
Understood, David. That will have to be the final word. Very unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.